lightly. And she said, really? She said, what'd you catch? Oh, hey, look me up again right there. I'm trying to make the screen black right there. There it is. He said, well, me and my dad went catfishing. We caught catfish. She said, how many? He said, 100. She said, little Johnny, you caught 100 catfish. He said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, how much did they weigh? He said, they weighed 100 pounds apiece. She said, Johnny, you mean to tell me that you caught 100 catfish and they weighed 100 pounds apiece? She said, that would be 10,000 pounds. It would sink your boat. He said, it didn't sink ours. Caught 100 catfish, weighed 100 pounds apiece. She said, Johnny, you're making that up. That is a lie. That is not true. In fact, she said, Johnny, what if I said I was driving to school today and this 10-foot grizzly bear jumped out of the woods, stopped my car, and was about to attack me. And there was this tiny teacup poodle that ran out of the woods and jumped up and grabbed that bear by its nose, flipped it over, and chased it into the woods. Would you believe that? Johnny said, yes, ma'am. That's my dog. Well, okay. This is the quote that I used last night to sum up the idea of evolution. It's exactly what you would expect from professors who are atheistic and evolutionary. We run into these kinds of professors on a regular basis. There is one not far from where I live, there in North Alabama, that his goal is to, when people come into his class, he asks them up front, do you believe in a God? And then he explains that what I'm going to do in this biology class for the rest of this semester is prove to you that there's not one. That's a pretty standard mode of operation for certain professors around the country, and that's what you expect. In fact, in this particular professor's class, close to where I live, one of the girls that came back to the Christian Student Center there said that she was just furious because he had everybody who believed in God stand up, and she stood up. But she was talking to the minister there, Josh Webster, and she said, I wasn't furious that this professor would do that to me, because that's what she expected. She said, what I was furious about was that I knew other kids in this class were believers in God, and some of them were from the Christian Student Center, and they wouldn't stand up. She was the only one, and she was looking around a class of kids that she knew they were creationists, and many of them New Testament Christians, and they wouldn't stand up for their belief. Now, why is that? The reason for that is fairly understandable. Now, it's not right, it's not justifiable, but it's understandable. People want to be like people around them. They don't want to seem like they're different. Now, there was some research done by Ruth Berenda. She had kids come into a classroom about 10 or 15 kids. Only one of them didn't know what was going on. She had a teacher stand up, and there were 3 lines on the board. One of them obviously the longest, the next middle, the next the shortest. And she told the class, she said, I want you to raise your hand when you see the teacher point to the longest line. So the teacher pointed to the shortest line and said, okay, class, anybody think this is the shortest? And nobody raised their hand. She pointed to the second shortest line. Now, 14 of the 15 kids were in on it. They knew this wasn't the longest, but they all raised their hand when she said, is this the longest? 14 out of the 15 raised their hand. The one kid who didn't know what was going on, that's what the test was about, looked around at the other 14 kids who were raising their hands. They knew, obviously, the line wasn't the longest. But 75 out of every 100 who came into that class, they raised their hand to say that was the longest line. And here was Ruth Berenda's conclusion. People would rather be wrong than be different. Okay, that's what you expect from evolutionists, from atheists, from people who say, I don't believe in God. It's not what you expect from people who believe in God. And yet, this is a poster on a wall in the science building of a university associated with the Church of Christ. And this poster says in pictorial form exactly what that quote says. An amoeba, to a worm, to a fish, to an amphibian, to a reptile, to a lower mammal, to a lemur, to a monkey, to a man. It's what you expect from people who don't believe in God and who don't know what the Bible says. It's not what you expect from people who say, yes, I believe that the Bible is the true story of creation. Continue with me. There again, this is what you expect from evolutionary atheistic teaching people, that we somehow evolved from lower primates like this Australopithecine that is called Lucy. It's not what you expect from somebody who takes the Bible as the inspired Word of God. How did humans get here according to Genesis chapter 1? God created Adam out of what? The dust of the ground, and He breathed into him the breath of life. And the only possible way that the human population could then multiply was if there was a female that was also created with Adam. And the Bible explains that God put Adam into a deep sleep and made that first female, Eve, out of his rib. That's the story of creation. That's what you expect from a person who believes in the Bible. And yet, my coworker Eric Lyons, his niece was going to a different university associated with the Churches of Christ, and she was sitting in a night class, and that professor in this night class said, yes, we have evolved from lower primates. Now, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is, on one hand, we are told that all the really smart people believe in evolution, and evolution is a scientific fact, and if you don't believe in evolution, then you're not up to modern science. That's what we're told. Now it's a lie. It's not true. Evolution, the tenets of it, say that you can get one kind of animal to change into another kind. It violates the law of biogenesis. Evolution says that you had to eventually get life to come from non-living chemicals. You can't do that. That violates the law of biogenesis. It's a scientifically untenable idea. The fact of the matter is, but that's what you're told. You're told that the smart people believe this. Well, and then also you got a lot of friends that are people who believe in the Bible and in God, and so you don't want to make it look like you're not a smart person, and you also don't want to alienate your friends who believe in God, and so lots of times a person will just stand right here in the middle, and when they're over here with their smart friends and they say, do you believe in evolution? They'll say, yeah. And then when they're over here with their people who believe the Bible, they'll say, do you believe that the Bible's true? Yeah. And they'll compromise both of the ideas. And they'll come up with something called theistic evolution. It's actually an oxymoron. You can't really have theistic evolution because evolution implies that there's no creator, no intelligence behind it. But theistic evolution is the idea that I'm going to take God, theos, and I'm going to take evolution, and I'm going to put them together, and I'm going to have where, okay, God did it, but He used evolution for it. Now, you're going to run into some real problems when you try to do that. Because the first problem you're going to see is, if you go to the story of creation, the sequence is not even the same. And what I mean by that is, okay, Big Bang. What came first according to the Big Bang? Stars or planet Earth? Well, according to the Big Bang, you had to have stars that were exploding and bringing the elements into existence, and then the sun had to come before Earth so that the gravitational pull of the sun, according to the Big Bang idea, the gravitational pull of the sun would have caused the space dust to coalesce around it and created the planet Earth. According to Genesis 1, which came first, Earth or the sun? God creates Earth on day 1, and then what day does He create the sun, moon, and stars? Day 4, they don't come around till 4 days after the creation of the earth. And then if you were just to look at several other things about the sequence of creation, it doesn't match up at all with evolutionary teaching. For instance, according to Genesis chapter 1, dinosaurs or birds created first? Well, birds are created on day 5, dinosaurs are created on day 6. Well, according to the evolutionary teaching right now, which one came first, dinosaurs or birds? Dinosaurs would have had to come first, they say, and then evolved into birds. You see the problem. The sequence is not the same. But here's what everybody admits, everybody. Evolutionists, creationists, they all admit this. That if you don't have those millions and millions of years to put somewhere, evolution could never have happened. Now, the fact of the matter is, if you got millions of years, it still couldn't happen. But everybody admits, even the evolutionists themselves admit, okay, if you don't have the millions of years, it could never have happened. So here's the question. Where do you put millions of years into the biblical account? How can you shove it in? Now, here's what I'm going to suggest to you. How many of you guys have seen, and girls of course, the animated movie Cinderella? You seen Cinderella? All right. In Cinderella, maybe you'll recall the prince has the glass slipper, and it's the Disney version of it, and you've got the 2 wicked stepsisters. Do you remember them trying to shove their feet into that little glass slipper? One of them had a really, really fat foot. and she tried to slide it in sideways, and it just would, and every time she put it in, it'd pop up. Okay, the other one had a really, really long foot. And she was trying to shove it in, and she'd shove the toe in, and boom, the back of it would pop up, and then she'd shove it. They just didn't fit in the slipper. And then, of course, you go to Cinderella, and it slips on perfectly. Well, here's what I would suggest. Trying to shove millions of years into the biblical text. You don't get it from the biblical text. It's not there. And so you've got people that are trying to shove it in, and it's just like those two wicked stepsisters. It just doesn't fit. You try to force it, and at every turn, something shows it's just not fitting. Okay, so where are you going to try to put this time? Before the creation, during the creation, after the creation? Well, here's what we're going to see. The Bible explains that in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, and all that is in them. Now, generally speaking, people who try to force time into the creation account, they got a real problem with this verse. But they then just redefine words that are in this verse. For in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and all that. If you're going to take this verse and it still mean anything, and you're going to try to get millions of years into the text, what are you going to do? Well, generally speaking, here's what they do. They say, yeah, but hold on just a second. What about that word days? Could it mean millions or billions of years? Could the creation mean on day one, it's not really a literal 24-hour day, it's actually millions of years, and a lot of stuff goes on in that one day, and that day is really actually a whole lot longer than 24 hours. That's the main argument used to try to get time into the creation. Now, at first, you and I both have to admit, okay, well, yeah, I mean, we use the word day sometimes, and we don't mean 24 hours, right? Back in my day, we walked uphill both ways to school in 3 foot of snow. And well, what's it mean back in my day? Back in my 24-hour period? The judgment day. The day the Lord's going to come as a thief in the night. What do we mean by that? Well, we don't mean a 24-hour period. There will come a day. When? Well, what does it mean there will come a day? When? There's going to come a period of time. So sometimes does the word day mean something other than 24 hours? Absolutely positively. So you've got to approach this with an understanding of how you ever come to meaning on any word in the Word. But now, let me explain to you what you mean. Here. If you're going to say these are not 24 hours, you don't need them to be 1,000 years. You don't need them to be 1,000,000 years. Folks, you need these days to be approximately 2 billion years each. Now, that's going to be important as we look at some other pieces of information, but let's also see this use of the word day. The opposite of night. Jesus said, I must work while it is day. The night is coming when no man can work. What do you mean? 12 hours approximately when it's light. That's when I work. I go to sleep at night. And His word for day was the opposite of night. Okay? No problem. We understand that. Also, a period of time in the future. Day of the Lord. There will come a day. Unidentified, you don't know how long it is. It's a period of time in the future. Then you have total days of creation. Genesis chapter 2 says, this is the story of creation in the day that God made them. Well, I thought it just said 6 days. Okay, the word day can mean the whole creation in the day that God made them. Easy to understand. And then a literal 24-hour day. No problem. Now, let me ask you the question. What does the word bear mean? B-E-A-R? Good question. Let me then ask you this. What does it mean in this particular anecdote? Jeremy and I were in the woods, and we saw a huge bear. I sat down and took off my dress shoes and started putting on my tennis shoes. Jeremy said, Kyle, why are you putting on your tennis shoes? You can't outrun a bear. And I said, I know. I don't have to outrun a bear. I just have to outrun you. Now, in that anecdote, what does bear mean? It's a large, furry, omnivorous creature that is potentially dangerous to humans. Okay, we understand that. No problem. Now, the load of bricks was too heavy for the young man to bear. What's it mean there? Physically carry. The emotional strain was too heavy for the young lady to bear. What's it mean there? A emotional burden. Okay, so you can have the word bear, B-E-A-R, And it means any number of things. What's the only possible way you're ever going to know what it actually means in a specific place? Context. Real easy to understand. So when Jesus says, I must work while it's day, the night's coming when no man can work, do you understand the context there? What's it mean? 12-hour period approximately of light and dark. See, so here's what I want you to understand. It's not hard to find out what the word day means. You just have to look at the context. Now, when you go to the context of Genesis chapter 1, and you read, God separated the light from the dark, light He called day, the dark He called night, and evening and morning, day 1. Okay, this term evening and morning, they're used together in the Old Testament, over 100 times in non-prophetic literature. Genesis, Exodus, they're all, by all accounts, everybody recognizes it's not prophetic. Every single time it's used with the word day, evening and morning, it always means a literal 24-hour period. Okay? You tracking there? Here's what I mean by that. It's never used once in the entirety of the Old Testament where evening and morning is not used to describe a literal 24-hour day. It would be an entirely new Hebrew construction that nobody's ever seen. Okay? And that's one context clue. Evening and morning. All right, now, continue with me. Day 3 of creation, you're going to run into some physical problems. Because if these nights, an evening and a morning, if this evening is a long extended period of millions of years of darkness, then what about the plants that are created on day 3? If they're created on day 3 and there's an evening of millions and millions of years of darkness, what's going to happen to those plants? They're going to die. If there are plants that have to be pollinated by an insect like the yucca plant, what's going to happen to it? If it's created on day 3 and there are millions of years until the insect comes along, what's going to happen to the yucca plant? It's going to die. So you're going to run into just a physical problem. Okay, if the evening is millions of years, what about plants that need sun? What about some of the physical problems you're going to run into with stuff that was created on day 3? Okay, then as you continue to look at this idea, Genesis 1:14 says that on day 4, God creates the heavens and the lights in the heavens, the lights in the firmament of the heavens, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, for days and years. If the days of Genesis chapter 1 are long extended periods of billions of years, then what in the world is a year? You're going to run into another problem there. So we've got it called an evening and a morning. We see that, okay, if plants were created on day 3 and there were millions of years of darkness, you're going to have a real physical problem. Then you've got this word where it says, okay, for days and years. So if a day is millions and millions of years, then what in the world is a year? It would make that senseless. You wouldn't be able to get anything from that at all. And then continue with me. You go to 2 Peter, but someone says, yeah, well, hold on just a second, Kyle. You know, over in 2 Peter it says, but beloved, don't forget this one thing, that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are as one day. Okay, now stop right there and let's analyze that context real quick. This is talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ. If you'll look up a few verses, it says, now scoffers are going to come in the last days, and they're going to say, where's the promise of His coming? For all things continue as they were since the fathers fell asleep. They're going to say, you guys are telling me Jesus is coming, and He hadn't come in the last 100 years, He hadn't come in the last 1,000 years, He's not coming. And now all Peter is saying here is, if God makes a promise today, it's as valid as if He made a promise 2,000 years ago. This has nothing whatsoever to do with the days of creation, and it has nothing whatsoever to say about God thinking that a day is 1,000 years. Notice two things in this context. Number one, it says a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years as a day. Now, you don't need 1,000 years. You need 2 billion per day. So can you go to this verse and say, yeah, well, this means the days of creation are 2 billion years? No, it says they're as. What does that mean? All it means is if God makes a promise, it's just as valid the day after He makes it as 2,000 years later. That's all this is saying. But here's what else I find real interesting in this context. God's trying to communicate the period of time of one day. In this context, what does one day mean right here? A literal 24-hour period. In this context, what does 1,000 years mean in this verse? 1,000 years of 365.24 literal days. So you see that if God wants to communicate the idea of a day and a year, He's very well able to do that. It's not hard for him to do that. Now, we're asking the question then, is that what he communicated in Genesis chapter 1? Number one, we've got evening and morning. Number two, when you have the Hebrew word yom, day, modified by a number, notice this, we fail to find a single example of the use of the word day in the entirety of Scripture when it means anything other than a 24-hour day. If you say there were 3 days, it's one thing to say there will come a day in the future. That's one thing, when you don't put a numeric adjective in it. But when you say there will come 2 days in the future, have you just now changed the meaning of that? Even in English? Yeah, 2 days in the future gives you a whole lot more than a day or back in my day. Exactly the same with Hebrew. Are there numeric adjectives that are attached to every one of the days of creation? Evening, morning, day 1. Evening, morning, day 2. Evening, morning, day 3. Evening, morning, day 4. Now let me tell you why I do this lesson. Dinosaurs are exciting. They're fun to learn about. They're fun to do. Looking at how a word is used in Hebrew is kind of dry. But here's what I find. 20% or so of the people in congregations where I go deliver this, number one, have always thought kind of they might be multiply millions of years, the days, or they absolutely are. Now let me tell you why I deal with that. I was reading a statement and article written by evolutionary atheists who were bemoaning the fact that they were having trouble convincing people of atheism. They said, we just cannot seem to get as many people to buy into atheism as we think should buy into it. But here's what they said. But if we can get them to adopt the gateway idea that there are millions and millions of years available, then I think it was something like 40% of the people who will adopt that idea will then buy into evolution and other teaching that they would not if they didn't buy into that idea. The idea of millions of years is a gateway idea that if a person buys into it, then it's much easier then for the evolutionists and the atheists to send over more incorrect teaching in this vein. Now, here's what we've got. Evening and a morning. Now we've got day modified by a number. There again, okay, there's not a single example anywhere that anybody can point to where day modified by a number in Hebrew, and especially the Hebrew Old Testament, is ever used for something other than a 24-hour period. It would be a new Hebrew construction that no Hebrew scholar has ever seen in the history of Hebrew study. You tracking with me? All right, furthermore, the plural of the word day. The word yom appears in its plural form, yamim, over 700 times in the Old Testament. It always means a literal 24 hour. 700 times. In non-prophetic literature, it always means a literal 24-hour day. Do you have anywhere where the word yamim, plural of the word days, is used to describe creation in non-prophetic literature? Yes, yes you do. In fact, Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11. For in 6 days. Now here's what we've got. Do we have context clues that tell us exactly what God's trying to communicate? Yeah. Evening and a morning, numeric adjective, and used in its plural form. It's one thing to say in my day. It's another thing to say 6 days from now. Used in its plural form in Exodus chapter 20, 700 times. And every single time in non-prophetic literature, it always means a literal 24 hours. Always. Now, you stop right there and someone will say, well, God could have made the world in 13 billion years. Yeah, He could have. Could have made it in 6 nanoseconds. 6 picoseconds. 6, I'm sure Harry Gardner could tell me some other thing besides a picosecond, but that's as far as I go. Could have made it in any amount of time that He wanted. So why do you say 6 days? Okay, when Moses stands up and delivers in Exodus chapter 20 the 10 Commandments, and he says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and on the 7th day He rested. Now that word rested is actually probably poorly translated. Should just say ceased His creative activity. It doesn't mean God was tired. Doesn't mean He needed a break. In the seventh day, He stops creating. Therefore, He says to the Israelites, you work for 6 what? Long extended periods of billions of years? No, you work for 6 days. What did they understand those days to mean? Literal 24-hour periods. And you rest for a day. What did they understand that to mean? Literal 24-hour period. Now here's what's very interesting. Do you know that the bulk of humanity from the time written records have been conserved use a 7-day work week? Now what natural phenomena do you have that gives humankind a 7-day work week? Now here's what you've got for a year. Where'd you get a year? 1 all the way around Earth, all the way around the sun, gives you 365.24 something days. That's the year. Where do you get a 7-day week from any natural phenomenon? It's not the moon cycle. It's not the month cycle. Where do you get it? You don't. There's no natural phenomena that gives you a 7-day work week, and yet humankind has used one from the very beginning, and virtually every single society has always used one. That came from creation. When God said, for in 6 literal days, if you take every single context clue, that's what you've got right there. Now, that's not all we've got, because here's your next problem. With the evolutionary scenario, now think with me on this. Supposedly, the Big Bang happened 13.82 billion years ago. They change it on a regular basis. Just a little while ago, it was 13.7. They came out with an article. They said, we're wrong, 120 million years. We need to add that. That was, I think, a year and a half ago, 2 years. So now it's 13.82, right? Okay, so if this is the supposed Big Bang, right here, at my longest fingertip, right here, and my outstretched arms represent the entirety of 13.8 billion years. Big Bang happens, time starts going right here. Right here is now, okay? When did humans, according to the atheistic evolutionary scenario, when did humans arrive on the scene? At the very tiniest tip of my longest fingernail. That's, according to the evolutionary scenario, where humans showed up. They didn't show up at the beginning. They weren't here halfway through. They weren't here 3/4 of the way through. They were here at the very end. We are the most newcomer, according to the atheistic evolutionary idea, that there is. Okay? Well, according to the Bible, when does the Bible say humans showed up? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Were humans separated from creation by billions of years? Well, not according to Jesus. When Jesus said from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female, what did He mean? From the very first week of creation. Humans weren't separated from creation by 13.81999 million years or whatever. From the beginning of creation, God made man. And you know why that makes so much sense. Because God created the world at the onset to be inhabited by what? Humans. And He crowned them with glory and honor and made them just a little lower than the angels, and He gave them dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every creeping thing that lived on the earth. The world was created for humans in the first place. And to think that somehow humans are separated from the beginning by 13.8 billion years, when Jesus Christ said from the beginning of creation, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. Who clearly sees the things that God made from the beginning of the world? Humans. Because He made them on the first week of creation. Now, that's where we're going to stop with this material, because I think that it's something you absolutely positively need to know. And I think it's something that is really, if you didn't get that idea of millions and millions of years somewhere else, you would never get it from the Bible. It's not something that you sit down and you read the story of creation and then you read Exodus and you say, oh, these days might be multiplied millions and millions of years. No, it's something that comes from outside of the Bible and people try to shove it in. And I'm trying to suggest to you, in fact, trying to more than suggest, trying to state that there's no possible way it fits if you're going to be honest and do justice to the text. It just simply does not. Now, we're going to have a period now of some questions and, oh, no, okay, I got a little bit more. All right, I thought I was done. I thought I changed this for today, but I didn't. Okay, so here's what you got. All right. If humans were created at the beginning, then how old are humans? Well, they're 5 days younger than the earth. So the earth is 5 days older than Adam and Eve, and then subsequently us. So here's all you got to find. You just got to find out how long humans have been around. Is that possible? Can you do that? Well, actually, it's not as hard as you think. From us to Jesus has been about how long? About 2,000 years, right? From Jesus to Abraham, about how long? He was around about 2000 BC, no problem. So then all you've got is from Abraham to Adam. Now, here's what's interesting, of course. The Bible gives you the genealogies, and 55 generations between Jesus to Abraham, that's 2,000 years. You've got 20 generations between Adam and Abraham. You can go to Genesis chapter 5, and you can calculate Adam was this old when he had his son Seth. Seth was this old when he had his son. You can calculate the ages that they were when they had their son. Had a 9-year-old come to the offices of Apologetics Press. He said, man, let me show you something. I calculated this up. And we can know approximately how long it was from Adam to Abraham. You can do it yourself. It's real easy to do. Go to Genesis chapter 5, Genesis chapter 11. Calculate the ages, and you're going to get approximately, why didn't I fill that in? It's supposed to be 2,000 years. I think at one time I had 2,000 years there, but somehow in my transferring this PowerPoint from, PowerPoint 1995 to PowerPoint 2017, it just did not come over. Here's what that's supposed to say right there, 2,000. You got approximately 2,000 years from us to Jesus, approximately 2,000 years from Jesus to Abraham, and you've got right at about 2,000 years from Abraham to Adam. Now, when someone asks me how old the earth is, I say approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Because these aren't absolute positive numbers, and let me tell you why. Because sometimes the generations, the genealogies will say, and Terah was 70 years old when he had Abraham, Nahor, and their brother. Well, they're not triplets. So here's what it means. He was 70 years old when he started having Abraham, Nahor, and so. So he might have had Nahor when he was 70, might have had Abraham when he was 72, might have had their other brother when he was 75. Now, there's no possible way you can fit millions of years into those genealogies. You could fit a few hundred. And so when we say it's approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old, we're gauging for statements like, figures of speech like, he was 70 years old when he had Abraham. Well, what does that mean? When he started having his children. Okay? So, there I think you have it. In a nutshell, I don't think it's hard to understand, but let me tell you what it is hard to do. It's hard to go into a classroom where there is a teacher who says, you know, only idiots think that the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Do you? You're 17 years old, this guy's got 2 PhDs, one from Harvard. You got to make a good grade in his class? You're going to raise your hand and say, yes, I think the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. I'm an idiot. You know, it's real difficult, isn't it? And then let me tell you what happens. You know it. Psychologically, this happens to us on a regular basis. You don't stand up for that truth that you know. You don't raise your hand. And so then, instead of later thinking I was a coward, I should have stood up for the truth, you start thinking, well, maybe it's not. Maybe, hey, yeah, maybe they are right. Maybe it's not that I just didn't stand up for the truth, but maybe there's not good enough evidence for it. And when you refuse to stand up for it, and then you step back and instead of saying, yeah, I should have stood up for it, that was just a cowardly act, I'll try to do better next time, you then say, well, maybe, you know what, maybe I wasn't wrong to not do that. Maybe there isn't evidence. And then you start trying to justify yourself. And then you start looking for ways to justify, well, you see how that goes. And so here's what we're going to explain. You understand and I understand. Christianity has never been popular. In fact, when Jesus says, broad is the gate and wide is the way that leads to destruction, many go in by it, but narrow is the gate, difficult is the way that leads to life. Why do you think in some of these discussions, like dinosaurs and the age of the earth and various things like that, why do you think that the world would get it right and people who are studying and following the Bible would get it wrong? Why is it you think, hey, we need to fall in line with the world on at least the age of the earth and dinosaurs? Yeah, maybe not this other stuff, but they've got to be right on that. If they're not right about so much else, if the majority is often so very wrong, why do we feel like we need to step in line with them on these issues? Let me tell you what I get all the time. I have people that make fun of generally they have the most fun with my name, and they don't get past that, Kyle. But if they do get past that, the number one belief that I get ridiculed for is the belief in a young earth. Now listen, if it was good enough for Jesus to say that humans have been here from the beginning of creation, you cannot make that statement and believe in the billions of years that are presented to us from atheistic evolution. So I'm just going to say I'm with Jesus. I'm going to say humans were here from the beginning of creation, and I'm going to stand on solid ground both scientifically, biblically, and historically. Appreciate you being here again. We're going to take a time now for some questions and answers. We'll just have you raise your hand. You can ask the question, and I'll try to repeat it for anybody that did not hear it, and then I'll try to answer it. There again, I say that we've only got one rule in question and answer sessions. It's a real simple rule. Actually, two, be cordial and polite. And rule number 2, don't ask any questions I don't know the answer to. So, real simple, just ask questions you think I already know the answer to. That will work perfectly. All right, about dinosaurs, about creation, anything that you want to ask about, feel free to go ahead. Yes, ma'am. Some. Yes, some, and some some won't let us. The ones that we showed you that were associated with the church, the first one where the poster was, the kid called us and got our book, Creation Compromises, that in great detail goes through all of this stuff. And I think he got 72 copies and passed them out to all the kids in his class and asked the professor if we could come in. And the professor basically said, no, nobody from Politics Express can come and speak here, and they're just not welcome. So in some places we can. In some places we can. It's a good question. But now here's what's interesting. Lots of times in public schools we get to go in and talk on this stuff. We have down in Alabama a author day. And one of my good friends is the principal of a 3rd through 5th grade elementary school there. And he said, Kyle, would you come and speak at Author Day? You know, lots of times they try to get famous authors, whatever. And he said, would you come and speak on Author Day? Just talk about any book that you've written and what's in it. So I took our Truth Be Told book and said, let me tell you what's in this book. People tell you about evolution. It's not true. Here's the evidence for it. And if you want one, there's 350 of them stacked up on the table out back. Pick you one up. So I spoke for 50 minutes on creation, and 350 kids picked them up at Truth Be Told and took it with them. Because in certain areas, well, the truth is it's legal all over the world. And what I mean, all over the country. What I mean by that is every court case that's been done says that you can take a Truth Be Told and you can put it on a table and passively distribute it. Meaning, you put it on that table and you say, if you want one, come get it. As long as you don't hand it to a kid, you can pass them out. Now, some principals, some teachers, etc., feel like it'll be too much trouble to do that and somebody might sue them or something like that, and so they just avoid it. But legally, any teacher that wants to can put these books in their classroom. If you as a teacher took 25, 30 Truth Be Tolds and put them on your desk and said, kids, every one of you can come pick one up. That is absolutely positively legal in every sense of the word. But most of the teaching has been, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. It's separation of church and state. And so they have really clouded the issue. But you can do that. It's actually... Now, my next thing there is, but so what if it was illegal? I mean, so what if it was illegal to tell a kid that God created him and that Jesus Christ is God's Son and that the Bible is God's Word? Are you then going to say, well, I can't because I'll lose my job if I tell him God created him. I'll lose my job if I tell him Jesus is God's Son. I'll lose my job if I tell him the Bible is God's Word, and so I just can't do that? Well, I mean, you go back to the example of the apostles in Acts, and they rejoiced that they counted themselves, that God counted them worthy to suffer for the name of Christ, and the Jerusalem Council said, it's illegal for you to teach about Jesus in this area, and we're going to imprison you, and we're going to beat you. And they said, you judge whether it's right to listen to you guys or God, but we're going to do what God told us to do, and that's spread the truth. Now, I'm a firm believer that you need to spread the truth in every sphere of influence that you've got. If you are a preacher, if you are an engineer, if you are a teacher, if you are a grocery store bagger, whatever it is, you have the responsibility to find a way to spread the truth about God in every sphere. So, that is something I think we need to think about. You got a question?
Have you ever found a dinosaur fossil?
That is a great question. Thank you. Have I personally ever found a dinosaur fossil? No, I haven't. Now, my coworker, Jeff Miller, and Dwayne Bryant went and found a Tyrannosaurus Rex tooth out in Wyoming last year, which was really, really exciting. Now, I have bought some. I have bought some over the internet that are actual dinosaur fossils. And some people have brought me some at a seminar and said, hey, what is this? Does this look like a dinosaur fossil to you? But me personally, I've never had the privilege of finding an actual fossil. But that's a really great question. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So my son is very into dinosaurs, and we've read lots of the books that Apologetics Press puts out. And it's very frustrating, from the school standpoint, that that is still what they teach about billions of years ago. And so every time we read a book about dinosaurs, we just stop and take a minute and say, that's not good. But what can be done, or what steps are being taken, if any, to try to put the right information in the schools?
Okay. All right, so let me ask you this question. What steps can be taken to put New Testament Christianity in the schools? And are there any being taken? Okay, the answer is really, on an official establishment basis, no. Now, I'm invited to a little school right outside of Alabama, right up across the Tennessee line every year, because there is a 6th grade teacher who's a member of the Lord's church, and she says, I want you to come and talk to us every year. Now, I take them Dinosaurs Unleashed once a year, about 90 of them. And I get in there and I start talking to them about creation, and when the word evolution pops up the first time, she says to her 6th grade class, we don't believe that, do we? And in unison, the class says, no, we don't believe that. Okay, so she has taken the whole time, before I get there in the spring semester of it, to teach them the truth. And so what I mean by that is, I believe that what will get done has to be on an individual principal-teacher basis. Because, like I said, my buddy who's the principal, well, it's totally legal. He knows it. But if he were to maybe go to the superintendent, even though it's legal, the superintendent would probably say, no, we don't want that kind of trouble. So he doesn't. He just doesn't ask. He just says, we're going to do it. And nobody has a single problem with it, because 80% of the people in that school are Christians and 90% of them are believers. Now, what I mean by that is, okay, if anything's going to get done, it's going to have to be done on a individual teacher or principal basis. And there's just going to be no establishment teaching on it, because, let's not kid ourselves. Who's the God of this world? The Bible says Satan is the God of this world. And are you going to get the establishment to let you teach the truth on this stuff or on Christianity? No, probably not. Now, let me say this though. I was going to add one thought to that. 90 to 95% of the stuff that's taught in the school systems, though, is true, and it's good stuff. It's only 10 to 15% of the stuff that's evolutionary garbage. So like when you take a physics book, if you're to go through the what's true in this physics book or this biology book, tons of the material has nothing to do with evolution or anything like that. So here's what I always tell my kids. I teach them everything I can about evolution. I let them read any evolutionary book. I am not afraid of the teaching, because evolution is false, and when you put it beside creation, it doesn't match up. So it's not something you should be afraid of. The Bible says that God hadn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of sound mind, and of love. Sound mind meaning we can look at this stuff and decide for ourselves. We're not idiots. And so if you put the two beside each other, what I always tell my kids is, okay, you're going to read a textbook, and there's going to be 95% of the stuff that's exactly right. 5 to 10% of it's going to be evolutionary junk. When you run over it, mentally just say that's evolutionary garbage and go through it. But you've got to know what it is that's garbage and what it is that's not, and you've got to critically think your way through it. And just so happens Christianity is really the only system that welcomes critical thought like that. When Paul said, test all things, hold fast what is good, he was telling Christians, critically analyze stuff. You know, several years ago in Cobb County, Georgia, it was 2002? They put that sticker in the front of the biology textbooks where it said this textbook contains information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. It should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. That's a verbatim quote of it. That got stricken from the books. They pulled it out because they said it was a violation of separation of church and state. Said the statement was too religious. I'm going to repeat it. This textbook contains information on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, about living organisms. It should be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Now, should Christianity be looked at with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered? Absolutely. Every single tenet of it. But do you know that if you do look at evolutionary teaching and evidence with an open mind, study it carefully, and critically consider it, you end up being a creationist? Like Mike Houts, who works for us, who was an atheist for about 25, 30 years of his life. He's got a PhD from MIT in aeronautic engineering. He is a squad leader, basically a research team leader at NASA. And he says, I just always bought what they were teaching me about evolution and atheism until one day I decided I'm going to start looking at it. And I'm going to see what it's really teaching. Now, and I'm going to do some of this Sunday. I had a guy come up to me the other day. It looked like he's about 25, shook my hand in tears. He was crying. And he said, Kyle, I just got to tell you. He said, I was heavy into biology, and I was about to lose my faith, and then I got in touch with some of your materials. He said, and it saved my faith, and I'm a Christian now. He was married, had a wife, I think he had a young kid there, and was really almost in tears telling me that at one of the seminars I was doing. Now, here's what I'm saying. Do you know what good a book does if it's sitting on the floor at Apologetics Press? I didn't hand him that book. I don't know how he got it, but somebody got it to him. And it literally changed the direction of his entire spiritual life. Now, that could be you. Could be that guy is your nephew, and you don't even know he's having doubts right now, but he needs this book. Could be that guy is a third grader in your son's class, and if you were to get him the book, Truth Be Told, and give it to him as a Christmas present, like this one lady did that contacted us, that could change the way he views creation for the rest of his life. I'm not saying that to give any credit to AP or anything other than God, I believe, works through the material that we're teaching, but if it doesn't get to the people that need it, it's not doing anybody any good. And it could be you who gets it there. All right? Next question. Yes, sir.
You talked a minute about the young earth and
Yes.
How you would talk to some, I guess, a scientist who said, I know this, I don't know if we could call it a fossil or whatever, is 20 million years old because we proved it through carbon-14 dating or whatever. How would you deal with something like that?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. Now, there's a reason I do not go over in my seminar carbon-14 dating and radiometric dating. Let me tell you, because it's very technical, and in my humble opinion, it's very boring. But if someone asks me the question, I then say, sorry guys, this guy asked, you have to blame the boringness on him. And so I actually have it in my lesson right here, but, okay, come on, hold on. Let me have my, where is it? Get through all this. Is that not my right lesson? I think I got another, okay. Hey, I got another one that's named Creation Compromise, I think, or it should be Buford. You're about to get some carbon-14 radiometric dating stuff. Now, you can't find it on there? I don't know, it should be Creation Compromise Buford or something like that. Did you pull up the wrong one? You got it now? That's not it. Okay, now let me give you a little bit of the background here. That keeps going to the. I wanted to show you this in PowerPoint form. Is that a different one? Is that the one we just did? All right, just throw that one up there. Please, sir. This the only one you got up there? All right. Okay. Too bad you're not getting the PowerPoint version of that. But let me tell you this. I'll give you the non-PowerPoint, non-technical version of that. Okay, radiometric dating. Well, let's go to carbon-14. Carbon-14 dating is a process by which something living dies, and it starts releasing carbon. And if you find something dead, and you can measure how much carbon is in it, then you, to this idea, you should be able to say how old it is based on it would have had this much carbon when it died, it's released this much carbon, and there's this much in it, and so it has to be X number of years old. Here's the problem with every single dating method that you've got. Even the guy who invented carbon-14 dating. He said carbon-14 dating only works to about 40,000 years. He said you can't go any further than that. And it only works on living things. Now, they started doing some tests on living things. They found a dead musk ox, and they carbon-14 dated his muscle tissue, and it dated to be 14,000 years old. They then carbon dated the hair on the back of his hip, and it dated to 7,000 years. Okay, so what would that have meant? You had a musk ox that lived 7,000 years with no hair until it grew some. Here's the problem with carbon-14 dating and every other dating method that you've got, and I'm going to show it to you. The assumptions you have to use to arrive at the date. Now, the assumption you got to use with carbon-14 dating, many of the same assumptions, you have to assume that the rate of decay has always been the same. Could anything change the rate of decay? Could. You have to assume that you know how much was in that thing to start out with. Could the environment have been different so that living creatures in the past retained more carbon than they do now? Yes. And you have to assume that nothing has changed that sample since it died and you've seen it. Could something go through the thing and take some carbon out? Yes. Now, let me then take that to radiometric dating. See, carbon-14 dating, nobody uses it for millions of years. They know it doesn't work. They know 40,000 years is the top limit, and it's not even good for 40,000 years. In fact, if you get over a few hundred or 1,000 years, the whole thing really is not useful. And they know that. And so they then go to radiometric dating. Now, work with me on this. Radiometric dating is the process by which radioactive elements break down into daughter elements. So you'll have uranium breaks down into lead. Okay? Now the half-life of uranium breaking down to lead, watch this with me. Let's say this is a 100-ounce sample of uranium. Okay? The half-life of uranium breaking down into lead is 4.5 billion years. So in 4.5 billion years, you should then have half of this sample being uranium and half of it being lead. Okay? So if you had 100 ounces, half-life of uranium breaking down into lead is supposedly about 4.5 billion years. So now you should have 50 ounces of uranium and 50 ounces of lead. In another 4.5 billion, what should you have? Well, no, because then your uranium breaks down, it's the half-life again. So uranium, your 50 ounces will now break down into 75 ounces of lead and 25 ounces of uranium. In another 4.5 billion, what will you have? Okay, keeps going like that. Now here's the problem with all radiometric dating, every single aspect of it. You can only radiometrically date igneous rocks, rocks that are formed in fire. And where we know the age of a rock, radiometric dating is always wrong. Let me show you what I mean. If there is an igneous rock that is formed from a volcanic emission in Hawaii, and you know that that island is 200 years old and that rock was formed 200 years ago, you know it for a fact. You go and date the rock using radiometric dating. Does it give you 200 years? No. In fact, most every time it gives you millions and millions of years. Now, you do that once, it would be something. But every single time we know the age of the rock sample, every time, radiometric dating never works. But then we're told it doesn't work on rocks where we know the ages, but when we don't know them, it's always real accurate. Okay? All right, you see the problem there. Now, here's the other thing that I find so very interesting. You can't get a date for a rock unless you ask it real nice and talk it. No, I'm just kidding. You can't get one unless you tell the dating laboratory, generally speaking, where you got it and how old you think it's supposed to be. They're not just going to give you a date for a rock. And here's why. Another problem. You might date it with uranium and lead dating and it give you 90 million years old, but then if you date it with potassium and argon dating, the exact same sample might give you 300 million. And then if you date it with another one of the breaking down elements, whatever it is, potassium, argon, uranium, lead, rubidium, strontium, it gives you another one. So you'll have one sample, you did it with uranium, lead, it gave you 90 million. With potassium, argon, it gave you 300 million. With rubidium, strontium, it gave you 28 million. So which one do you take? Which one do they take? Whichever one that they think fits into where they thought it was found. That's the one they take. Now, here's the second problem with, second, 20th, whichever one you want to say. Here's the other problem with radiometric dating. You have to know and assume three things about every sample you find. Number one, you have to assume that the rate of decay has always been the same for 4.5 billion years. Okay, that's what you got to assume. Now, you see a guy chopping wood in the forest. He chops down one tree in an hour. He's got 24 trees on the ground. How long has he been working? 24 hours. You go down, you talk to him. You say, hey man, see you've been working 24 hours. That's a lot of work. He said, what are you talking about? You said there's 24 trees on the ground and I saw you cut the last tree. It took you an hour. He said, oh yeah, well this morning when I was full and my axe was sharp, I was cutting 6 or 8 trees an hour. My quota is 24, and so I just had to get one more, so it only took me an hour to get that last one, but I haven't been here 24 hours. I've only been here 8.5. Okay, if you assume the same rate for the guy, you're going to be off by what? 16 hours. If you assume the same rate of decay over 4.5 billion years, there's a good chance you could very well be off, because how do you know the rate of decay has been the same for 4 billion years? You don't. You're guessing that. You're saying that that's the case, but you don't know that for sure. In fact, well, it gets even a little more technical. But number one, the assumption is the rate of decay has always been the same. Number two, the assumption is nothing has touched the sample for 4.5 billion years. Could there have been some water that seeped through the sample that took out some uranium or added some lead? Could there have been something that touched this sample in 4.5 billion years that would have adjusted what was in it? Yeah. So to assume that nothing's touched it for 4.5 billion years, and then, number three, you have to assume that there was no daughter element in it to start out with. Okay, this is all based on you got a 100-ounce sample that 50 ounces of lead came from the 100 ounces of uranium, but what if there was some lead in it to start with? What if you had 20 ounces of lead in it to start with? Would that adjust the date that you have? Absolutely, positively. In fact, I mean, suppose you go to a guy's swimming pool, he's running a hose in it, and there's 3,000 gallons in the swimming pool, and you check the hose and it's pumping in 100 gallons an hour. How long has that hose been pumping water into the swimming pool? 30 hours? Is that right? So you knock on the door, you say, hey man, I noticed you've been running that hose 30 hours. He said, what are you talking about? You said, well, I calculated how long the hose been pumping water into it. It's a 3,000 gallon pool, so it's got to be 30 hours. He said, no, it rained humongous last night and filled up our pool most all the way. I just was running the hose to top it off. I've just been running it for an hour. If you assume there was no water in it to start with, you're going to have a very serious problem with the age that you give it, the time that it's been running. If you want some real technical discussion on this, there's a bunch of it out there. There's the popular version that anybody with a high school education can read, a book by Donald DeYoung, who wrote a book titled Thousands Not Billions. It's really, really good. Donald DeYoung wrote Thousands Not Billions, and it goes into some of this. It's a summary of 2 humongous books that are about 1,000 pages each, I think, that are findings from the RATE project, R-A-T-E. So his summary, Thousands Not Billions, summarizes the like 2,000 page double volume rate project findings. So if you wanted some of that, that's out there. And what I would just say is, here's what I find so very interesting about the dating methods. 40 years ago, they said the age of the earth is this, and we know it to be a fact. 40 years before that, they said the age of the earth is this, and we pretty much know it from scientific evidence. 40 years before that, they said it's this. Do you know that on average, the age of the universe has doubled every 40 years, on average? And every time the scientific community has said, we've got a dating method that gives you that exact age. All right, so if 200 years ago, they said it was this old, and then 40 years later it doubled, what did that mean about the scientific method that they gave us that told us it was younger? It was wrong. All right, so it doubled the next 40 years. What did it mean about that one? Wrong. So if on average it's been doubling every 40 years, 40 years from now, I mean, like I said, a year and a half ago it was 13.8 billion. They said, no, we're off on that. It's 13.7. They said, no, it's actually 120 million years older than that. Okay? They said it in one paragraph. If you blinked, you missed it. 40 years later, they're probably going to say, you know, we thought it was 13.8 billion. No, it's not. It's 26 billion. And now we've got a dating method that will prove that. Well, if every single one of them to date has been wrong, what does that help us understand about the one they're saying right now proves this date? Well, it's probably not valid because it's based on assumptions. Now, if you grant them all the assumptions, okay, yeah, the math works if you grant those assumptions, but how do you know how much was in the original sample? And how do you know that the rate of decay has always been the same? And how do you know that nothing's touched that sample for the last 4.5 billion years? Really good question. All right. Next question. Yes, sir.
Carbon dating the dinosaur soft tissue.
You want me to tell you what they said about that? All right, so Eric calls one of the scientists that found the tissue, and she said, in the course of it, she said there's black stuff around it, looks like carbon. And so Eric asked her, he said, well, did they ever carbon date the dinosaur bones? Good question. Here's what she said. No, you wouldn't carbon date them because you know they're millions of years old. So she said if you did carbon date the dinosaur bones, she said you wouldn't do that, and if you did find carbon, she said it would be some type of contamination. So here's what you got. We're assuming they're millions of years old. We're not then even going to date them because if we found out they had carbon in them, we would just say, hey, that's contamination. That's the proverbial cart before the horse. Yes?
So if you're saying that there's a young Earth,
That's right.
you can didn't happen, because that's like
Yes. Okay, now, there are lots of things, like I said, there's lots of things in books that are right. They just add a little bit of incorrect information. So Pangea, could it be that all of the land was at one time in the past together? You know, when you look at a map, it very much looks like that. In fact, not only that, but if you look at a map and the continents where one looks like it should be where the other one is, well, on this side you've got a certain kind of rock, and on this other side you've got the same kind of rock from the two different continents that look like they should be together. So, is Pangea a legitimate, maybe historic idea? Could be. In fact, when you read Genesis 1, where it says he separated all the land, and the land he called land, and the sea he called sea, it looks like it pulls it all in there in one spot. Now, is that a problem for a creationist? Not at all. Insofar as, yes, all the land could have been in one spot, but the way that they calculate how long ago that happened was they say, okay, I'm going to look at a continent now and I'm going to see how fast it's moving. Well, it's moving 1 centimeter every 1,000 years, or whatever, I don't know what it is. They say, so if it's 1 centimeter every 1,000 years, then we're 3,000 miles apart, so this would have had to have happened X number of millions of years ago. Okay, that's where you run into a problem, because could it have been faster in the past? I mean, like, let's say there's a global flood and stuff is cracking from the bottom up and the fountains of the deep are breaking. Could you have some massive plate tectonic movement and stuff be moving out quicker than that? Yeah. So, yeah, Pangea is probably a good idea, but it didn't happen millions of years ago. Okay, we're going to take a break here, and that's going to be our last question. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back in here in about 10 minutes, and we will do the last part of this seminar, equipping us to be able to answer people who have challenges to our faith and dealing with that. I've kept you an hour and a half here, and no, I haven't, an hour and 25 minutes, and you have listened so very patiently, and I appreciate it. And I know you could have been anywhere that you wanted to be on this Saturday, but you chose to be here, and I think that is certainly commendable. We're going to take a 10-minute break, come back at 3:35, and have the last 30-minute session, 25, 30-minute session of our